The check sat on the table between them, like something alive. $2 million. The kind of number that could rewrite a life, dissolve a debt, rebuild a future from nothing. Victoria Sterling had written it without hesitation, the way she did everything with precision, with confidence, with the quiet certainty that money, properly applied, solved every problem worth solving. She pushed it across the polished mahogany surface and waited. She had never waited long for anything. The room was full of people who understood that. Her assistant, her legal counsel, 3 members of her executive team, all of them holding their breath, all of them watching the man on the other side of the table. He looked at the check for a long moment, then he looked up at her. And then, without a word, without anger, without the slightest tremor in his expression, Ethan Carter slid it back. "Keep your $2 million, he said. The silence that followed was the kind that filled a room completely, the kind that left no space for sound or thought or breath. Victoria Sterling had built Sterling Global from a single inherited office and a borrowed line of credit into one of the most powerful investment conglomerates on the eastern seaboard. She had faced hostile takeovers, regulatory audits, market collapses, and the particular cruelty of being a woman in rooms designed to make her feel small. She had never, in 23 years of doing business at the highest level, been refused. Not like this. Not by a man in a maintenance uniform who smelled faintly of machine oil and didn't seem to understand what $2 million meant. She watched him stand, button the top button of his worn canvas jacket, and walk toward the door. He did not look back. When the door closed behind him, no one in the room spoke. They were all waiting for Victoria to tell them what to feel. She said nothing for a very long time. She picked up the check, folded it once, and slipped it into the inside pocket of her jacket. Then she straightened her sleeves and looked out the window at the rain-soaked city below. What she felt, she could not have named. It was not quite anger. It was not quite admiration. It was something stranger than either a small, persistent disturbance in the part of herself she had spent decades learning to keep perfectly still. 10 days later, when the worst crisis in the history of Sterling Global tore through the company like a blade, she would understand that the man who walked away from $2 million was the only person standing between her and total ruin. But she didn't know that yet. That morning, she only knew that something had shifted. And whatever it was, she could not put it back. It had started 36 hours earlier, at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the new Sterling Advanced Research Center on the northern edge of the financial district. The building was 42 stories of glass and steel, a monument to what money and ambition could produce when properly aligned. Victoria had stood at the podium on the 3rd floor, speaking to a room full of board members, journalists, and city officials about innovation and legacy and the future of technology investment. Outside, the November sky had gone the color of iron. And by the time her remarks concluded, the rain was coming down in sheets against the tall windows. What happened next was not in the program. A fault in the building's newly installed electrical grid, a minor calibration error that somehow survived 3 separate contractor inspections, sent a surge through the entire system at 7:42 in the evening. Every light in the building went dark. Emergency backup power flickered on for 8 seconds and then died. In the conference rooms, the presentations went black. In the server rooms on floors 11 through 15, the cooling systems shut down, and the temperature began to climb toward the threshold at which irreplaceable data gets permanently destroyed. The engineers on site ran. Not literally, they moved quickly, professionally, toward their stations and their laptops and their emergency protocols, but their faces said what their feet would not. They were overwhelmed. The fault was cascading through the system faster than the diagnostics could track it, branching into subsystems no one had anticipated, touching equipment that was not supposed to be interconnected. 3 of them were already on the phone with the contractor. 2 more were shouting in technical language that grew progressively less technical and progressively more desperate. Nathan Reeves, Victoria's chief of staff, appeared at her elbow with the particular expression he wore when he was trying to manage her alarm while managing his own. He told her the situation was under control. She could see from the sweat on his collar that it was not. She stood very still, in the center of the darkened lobby, surrounded by confusion, and watched. She noticed the man in the gray coveralls because of what he was not doing. He was not running. He was not shouting. He was not on the phone. He had a small flashlight clipped to his shoulder, and he moved through the chaos the way a person moves through a familiar room in the dark calmly, with purpose, touching walls he already knew were there. She watched him crouch beside an access panel near the base of the central elevator bank, remove the cover with 2 turns of a manual screwdriver, and study the interior with the flashlight for exactly 4 seconds. Then he stood, crossed to a secondary panel near the emergency stairwell, opened it, and began to work with the focused quietness of someone who has already solved the problem and is simply executing the solution. Around him, 6 engineers continued to argue about what to do. He said nothing to any of them. He worked. The lights came back on at 8:04. 22 minutes after they had failed, the server rooms stabilized. The data held. The backup systems reconnected in sequence, exactly as designed. The engineers stopped arguing. Someone said, "How did?" and then stopped. The man in the gray coveralls was already closing the access panel, already wiping his hands on a cloth he pulled from his back pocket, already moving back toward whatever corner of the building he had come from. Victoria said to Nathan, "Who is that?" Nathan did not know. He found out. His name was Ethan Carter. He was 38 years old. He had been employed by the building's facilities management contractor for 14 months, assigned to routine maintenance and system oversight for the Sterling Research Center since its operational startup 6 weeks prior. His personnel file was 4 pages long and contained nothing unusual performance reviews that used words like reliable, methodical, and thorough, a clean record, a home address in a mid-range residential building 20 minutes by subway from the financial district. Nathan delivered this information to Victoria the following morning, with the air of a man reporting on a satisfactory but unremarkable inventory audit. Victoria thanked him and asked him to arrange a meeting. Nathan asked what kind of meeting. She told him a brief one. A courtesy, an expression of gratitude from the company to an employee who had performed exceptionally. Nathan nodded and made the arrangements. And if he thought anything unusual about the fact that Victoria Sterling was personally requesting a meeting with a maintenance technician, he kept it to himself. Ethan Carter arrived at the executive suite on the 39th floor at 10 o'clock the following morning, which was a Thursday. He wore clean clothes, dark trousers, a dark shirt, a canvas jacket that had been pressed but could not entirely conceal its age. He moved through the space the way he had moved through the darkened lobby without performance, without the particular kind of self-consciousness that most people brought into rooms designed to impress. He shook Victoria's hand when she offered it and sat when she gestured to the chair across from her desk. He accepted the coffee her assistant brought and held it without drinking. He looked at her with calm, dark eyes and waited for her to say what she had brought him there to say. Several of Victoria's executives were present, arranged along the far wall with the careful casualness of people who had been told not to make it obvious they were watching. The room had a particular quality of attention, a held breath, a sense of ceremony. Victoria had arranged it that way without thinking about it. The way she arranged everything for effect, for weight, for the proper communication of significance. She told him what he had done. She told him how close the system had come to total failure. Nathan, standing to her left, supplied the numbers he had prepared. 14 servers at critical temperature. An estimated 48 hours of encrypted trading data at risk. A projected recovery cost that began at $30 million and climbed rapidly from there depending on which clients demanded restitution. She watched Ethan's face as Nathan spoke. Nothing moved in it. He listened the way a person listens to information they already possess. When Nathan finished, Victoria said what she had planned to say. That the company was grateful. That his action had been extraordinary. That Sterling Global believed in recognizing performance that exceeded expectation. She opened the leather folder on her desk, removed the check, and placed it in front of him. $2 million. His name, typed cleanly, in the payee line. She had signed it herself. Around the room, something shifted in the posture of the watching executives. One of them, a a man named Richard, who ran the analytics division, made a small involuntary sound that was almost a laugh, but was actually envy, naked, and quickly swallowed. "Not many people get an opportunity like this," Victoria said. She meant it as kindness, as acknowledgement. She meant it the way she meant most things she said, in formal settings, with precision and sincerity wrapped in a register that left no room for misunderstanding. Ethan looked at the check. He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked up and said, "I was just doing my job." It was not false modesty. It was not performance. It landed in the room like a stone landing in still water, and the ripples were visible on every face. Victoria said, "Everyone has a price." She had said this before, in other rooms, in other negotiations. It was not cruelty, it was, she believed, a simple statement of observed reality. She had built a career on understanding it. Ethan was quiet again for a moment that seemed longer than it was. "Not everyone," he said, and then he picked up the check and set it back in front of her, and stood and left. Victoria did not move immediately. She sat at her desk and looked at the check and tried to identify what she was feeling. Richard said something from across the room, something meant to be reassuring, some recalibration of the moment into familiar terms, and she raised one hand slightly from the surface of the desk, a gesture small enough that only Nathan, who had been with her for 9 years, understood it to mean, "Do not." She sat with it. The check, the absence of the man who had declined it. The strange, flat quality of the room in the wake of something that had no precedent in her experience. She had been insulted before by competitors, by journalists, by politicians with their own agendas, but those insults had always carried the weight of desire underneath them, the hunger of someone who wanted something she had. This had been something else entirely. It had been a simple no, clean and complete, without residue. She began, that afternoon, to find out who Ethan Carter actually was. She did not do this through official channels. She did not send a formal request to her intelligence unit or assign it to the legal team as part of a standard background check. She asked Nathan quietly, as they walked between meetings, and then she made a few calls herself, to people who owed her the particular kind of favor that involves no paperwork and leaves no trail. What she found, at first, confirmed what the file said. He lived simply. He had no significant debt. He had no visible investments, no secondary income, no real estate beyond the apartment he rented in the modest building in Carroll Gardens. He did not appear on any social platform that she or her researchers could find. His colleagues at the facilities company described him in ways that matched the performance reviews: reliable, quiet, good with systems, never late, rarely social beyond the ordinary courtesies of shared work. One woman who managed the office scheduling said he sometimes brought in coffee for the whole team on Fridays and never mentioned it afterward. Another man, a senior technician named Dave, said Ethan had helped him understand a wiring fault in another building that 3 other technicians had spent 2 weeks trying to diagnose. He just looked at it, Dave said. Like, really looked at it. And then he said, "The problem is here." And it was. What Victoria could not find, at first, was anything that explained why a man of evident intelligence and competence was doing maintenance work on someone else's buildings for a salary that represented, by her estimate, approximately 1/70th of what he had once earned in a single fiscal quarter. Because that was the second thing she found. It arrived through a quiet call to a contact at a major financial registry service, a woman who had once done a very good thing for Victoria at a significant personal cost and who, over dinner 3 years ago, had made clear that she considered the favor repaid in the form of a standing willingness to answer questions that were not, technically, public record. The answer to the question Victoria asked her, about Ethan Carter, formerly of several institutional addresses that Victoria immediately recognized, arrived in a series of 3 short sentences. He had been, 12 years ago, one of the youngest senior portfolio architects at a firm called Halcyon Capital Partners, a mid-sized but extraordinarily aggressive hedge fund that had operated in the space between quantitative analysis and high-risk emerging market speculation. He had been, by every account, very good at it. And then, at 31 years old, at the precise moment when his trajectory was pointing toward a kind of career that generated the specific variety of wealth that allowed people to stop thinking about money entirely, he had resigned. He had not left for a competitor. He had not been pushed. He had not, as far as anyone could determine, taken another position in the industry. He had simply stopped. He had liquidated his stake in the fund's internal equity structure, cleared his desk, shaken hands, and walked out of finance with the finality of a man leaving a burning building. No one knew why. His colleagues at Halcyon, when they remembered him at all, described him in terms that were almost identical to the terms his maintenance coworkers used. Good at the work. Quiet. Reliable. Thorough. The only divergence was in the scale of the thing they were describing. He could see things other people couldn't see. One former analyst had apparently said, years ago, to a journalist writing a piece about Halcyon's unusual early structure. Not just patterns, the space between patterns. Where the risk was hiding, the journalist had not included the quote. Victoria's contact had found it in the original notes, filed away. Victoria wrote it on a legal pad in her own handwriting and looked at it for a long time. She thought about what it meant to walk away from something you were very good at. She had never done it. She had never seriously considered it. The work was the thing, it had always been the thing. From the beginning, from the small office, and the borrowed credit line, and the first deal she had closed entirely on her nerve, and the preparation she had done at 2 a.m. while other people were sleeping. She could not imagine turning her back on it. She could not quite imagine what a person was looking for on the other side of that decision. She sat in the quiet of her office after everyone else had gone home and thought about Ethan Carter drinking coffee in a neighborhood cafe, riding the subway at rush hour, carrying his tools through other people's buildings, fixing what was broken without being asked to explain why. She thought, what does a person have to lose before they learn that? What does it cost to get to the place where $2 million is simply not worth the trouble? She did not arrive at an answer. But the question stayed with her. And that was unusual enough to notice. The crisis arrived on a Monday, 10 days after the check. It arrived, as the worst crises do. In the middle of something ordinary, Victoria was in her car between meetings when the first call came from the head of her trading operations, and by the time she arrived at the Sterling Global Tower, Nathan was already at her elbow with a tablet in each hand, and the expression he wore when the situation was past managing and had become something that required surviving. Sterling Global's largest current position, a complex leveraged stake in a consortium of infrastructure development bonds that represented, at its peak, approximately $400 million in underlying exposure, had begun to unravel in ways that did not follow normal market mechanics. The unraveling was too fast, too precise, too perfectly timed to the moments of maximum vulnerability to be explained by organic market movement. It looked, to the analysts who were watching in real time from the trading floor, like what it was, a coordinated attack. Someone was driving the price down, not just trading against them, orchestrating a collapse, engineering a panic, deploying a cascade of short positions and false signals through a network of shell instruments that were designed to be difficult to trace and impossible to stop quickly. The board convened in emergency session that afternoon. Victoria sat at the head of the long table and listened to 14 people offer 14 versions of the same essential message. We need to do something. And we do not know what. The public-facing numbers were already ugly. The stock had dropped 11% by midday and was continuing to fall. 3 institutional investors had called to express, in the careful diplomatic language of institutional investors, what was actually a kind of controlled terror. 2 more had not called, which was worse. The financial press had discovered the story within hours of the morning open, and by afternoon, the coverage had the quality of a feeding, competitive, fast-moving, certain of nothing except that something significant was failing. Nathan managed the communications. Legal managed the regulatory posture. The head of trading managed the floor. Victoria managed all of them, because there was no one else to do it, and because the alternative to managing it was something she did not allow herself to consider. She had not built this company to watch it come apart in a Monday morning panic. She had not built it at all. She looked at the faces around the table, competent people, all of them, good at their work, and saw that none of them had what was needed for this particular problem. This problem required someone who understood not just markets but the specific architecture of a manipulation, someone who knew, from the inside, how attacks like this were designed and where they were vulnerable. Nathan, in a quiet moment at the edge of the session, showed her a preliminary finding from the technical analysis team. The structure of the attack had a particular signature. It bore the fingerprints of Halcyon Capital Partners. Ethan arrived at the Sterling Global Tower at 7:45 on Tuesday morning. The same building where 10 days earlier he had come to a meeting and declined $2 million. He came through the lobby in the same canvas jacket, carrying a cup of coffee in a paper cup from the cart at the corner. The receptionist, who had been briefed, called upstairs and told Nathan he was there. Nathan came down personally to collect him, which was a thing Nathan did not typically do for anyone. The emergency board session was already in progress. When the doors opened and Ethan walked into the room, the effect was immediate and strange, a shift in the quality of attention that moved around the table like a current. These were people accustomed to commanding rooms, accustomed to the particular theater of power that required everyone present to perform some version of importance. Ethan performed nothing. He set his coffee cup on the credenza near the door and looked at the screens arrayed along the far wall, the ones showing the live market data and the cascade charts and the timeline of the attack as the analysts had been able to reconstruct it. He looked at them for a long moment. Then he pulled out the chair at the foot of the table, the seat farthest from Victoria, at the opposite end, and sat down. Victoria looked at him across the length of the table. "You came," she said. He nodded. "I heard you had a problem." The board members looked at each other. One of them, Charles Wentworth, the longest-serving director, a man whose institutional skepticism was famous in boardrooms across 3 cities, said, "Who is this person?" Victoria said, "Someone who understands your problem." Wentworth said, "That's not an answer." Ethan said, without turning to look at Wentworth, still looking at the screens, Halcyon Capital's signature is in the short ladder. The timing intervals on the secondary positions are 17 minutes apart. That's a Halcyon protocol from about 11 years ago, before they automated it. Someone is running an old playbook, which means either they're operating without current infrastructure, or they want you to be able to trace it. He paused. "I don't think they want you to trace it. I think they've been out of the business long enough to have forgotten that the pattern is identifiable." The room was quiet. The analysts looked at each other. One of them, a young woman named Claire, who ran the forensic trading desk, pulled up a secondary chart and began typing rapidly. 40 seconds later, she said, "He's right. The intervals are exactly 17 minutes. Ethan asked for the complete transaction log going back 14 days. He asked for the counterparty exposure report on the infrastructure bond position. He asked for the internal communications archive from the last quarter, specifically the channel involving the bond consortium partners." Nathan looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at Ethan. "Those are confidential documents," she said. Ethan nodded. "I know." He waited. The waiting had the same quality as everything else about him: patient, without agenda, entirely comfortable in its own stillness. She held his gaze for a moment that was not quite a standoff and not quite a surrender. Then she said to Nathan, "Give him access." What followed was 31 hours that Victoria would later describe, to the single person she told about it, as the strangest and most clarifying experience of her professional life. Ethan worked the way he had worked in the darkened lobby of the research center, quietly, methodically, with a speed that became visible only in retrospect, when you looked at what he had done and tried to understand how quickly he had done it. He moved through the transaction logs the way a surgeon moves through tissue, following specific signals, ignoring what was healthy, finding what was wrong. He built a map of the attack across a whiteboard that covered an entire wall of the conference room. And as he added to it, layer by layer, a picture emerged that was almost elegant in its design. A network of interconnected positions and counterpositions, timed to reinforce each other in sequence, designed to create the impression of organic market collapse, while actually being driven by a small number of coordinated actors operating through instruments that were difficult to see individually and devastating in aggregate. He explained it as he worked, not for the benefit of his audience, but as a way of thinking aloud, narrating his own reasoning in the clean, spare language of someone for whom complex systems are simply a native language. The analysts gathered behind him. Claire from the forensic desk stopped typing and started listening. Even Wentworth, who had not entirely abandoned his skepticism, drifted closer to the whiteboard and stayed there. Victoria watched all of this. She had taken a chair at the far edge of the room, out of the main line of Ethan's sight, and she watched him the way she sometimes watched the market, with the full force of her attention, looking not just at the surface but at the structure beneath it. She watched how he treated the people around him, without condescension, without performance, with a respect that seemed simply automatic, the default setting of a person who had never found any particular reason to feel superior to others. She watched how he handled uncertainty, not by deflecting it or minimizing it, but by marking it clearly on the board with a question mark and returning to it after accumulating more evidence. She watched how he moved when no one was looking at him, when the room's attention had drifted to a screen or a printout, with the same quality of presence, the same steadiness, as if he was equally himself, whether observed or alone. She thought, "This is what it looks like when someone has nothing left to prove." At 3 in the morning on the second night, when most of the analysts had cycled out and back in again, when the coffee had been replaced 3 times and the whiteboard had evolved into something that covered 2 walls and part of a third, Ethan found it, the root transaction, the single originating instrument from which the entire cascade had been launched, a synthetic option position opened through a shell entity registered in a small financial center in the Eastern Atlantic, timed to trigger at a specific price threshold, and designed to activate the chain reaction that followed. He stood in front of it for a long moment. Then he said, without particular drama, "I know whose structure this is." He turned to Victoria. "You have someone on your board who has been working with the fund behind this attack for at least 18 months. The room was very quiet. "I know who it is," Ethan said. "I have evidence." He laid it out methodically, the way he had laid out everything else. The communications, the timing signatures, the pattern of information leakage from inside the company that had made the attack possible, the specific vulnerability in the bond position that no one outside the executive level should have known about, appearing in the trade timing of the attacking entity, approximately 48 hours after it had been discussed in an internal board session. One board member had been present at that session. One board member had the relationships, the financial motive, and the operational history with external hedge fund actors to make the connection plausible. The evidence did not constitute proof beyond legal doubt that would require a formal investigation, regulatory involvement, the work of months. But it constituted, Ethan said quietly, enough to act on, enough to stop the attack, enough to protect the company in the short term while the formal process played out. He set the final document on the table. The name on it was Nathan Reeves. Victoria stood absolutely still. The people in the room were watching her. She looked at the document. She looked at the timeline. She looked at the communications chain, the flagged exchanges, the fingerprint of strategic information moving from inside the building to outside in a pattern that, once you saw it, was impossible to unsee. She thought about 9 years. She thought about Nathan at her elbow, in the lobby of the darkened research center, telling her the situation was under control. She thought about Nathan presenting Ethan's background check the following morning, presenting it as thin and unremarkable, in a way that she had not questioned, because she had had no reason to. She felt something she did not have a familiar name for, not betrayal exactly, because betrayal required surprise, and some very quiet, very old part of her had always known that everyone, eventually, had a price. The surprise was not that Nathan had one. The surprise was that she had not seen it. She looked at Ethan. He looked back at her with the same calm, dark eyes. He did not look satisfied. He did not look sorry for her. He looked the way he always looked, present, steady, without performance. She said, "How long have you known?" He said, "Since I saw the interval signature, I needed the communications log to confirm it." She said, "Why didn't you tell me immediately?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because you needed to see it yourself," he said. "You needed to be the one who knew, not someone who was told." Nathan was confronted at 6 in the morning in a conference room on the 40th floor, with legal counsel, a board representative, and the preliminary evidentiary package that Ethan had assembled, he did not deny it immediately. He sat across the table with the particular stillness of someone who had been running a very long calculation and had finally reached the end of it. Then, slowly, he began to speak. The full account took 2 hours. He had been approached 16 months ago by the principals of an external fund, not Halcyon directly, but a successor entity, operating with some of the same personnel and much of the same methodology that had been systematically accumulating a short position against Sterling Global since the spring. They had offered him a stake in the fund's profits from the attack, contingent on his providing the internal access that made the attack possible. He had known Victoria for 9 years. He had worked for her, faithfully, he said, for most of those years, but at some point he could not say exactly when. Could not point to a single moment the faithfulness had become something that felt less like loyalty and more like subordination, and the subordination had come to feel, in his private accounting, like a debt that was never going to be repaid. He had wanted, he said, to own something, to have something that was his. He had made a choice. He knew what it was. He was not asking for understanding. The formal investigation was underway by midday. Regulatory notifications were filed. Legal engaged with outside counsel. The board, convening without Nathan and with an emergency quorum, voted to accept his immediate suspension pending investigation and to authorize the stabilization measures Ethan had outlined. By early afternoon, the mechanisms of the attack had been sufficiently identified and countered that the cascade began to slow. By the closing bell, the stock had recovered 6 points. By the following morning, the financial press had the story, not all of it, not the internal details, but enough to shift the narrative from collapse to resilience, and the phrasing that kept appearing in the coverage was words like swift action and sophisticated response, and, in one publication that Victoria found herself rereading twice, extraordinary precision. Sterling Global's institutional investors, who had been circling with the particular patient concern of people whose concern is primarily financial, received private communications from the company's investor relations team and grew, for the moment, quieter. The crisis was not over. It would not be over for months. But it had been met. It had been named. And it had been stopped. Victoria found Ethan in the conference room at 4 in the afternoon. The whiteboard maps were still on the walls. Most of the analysts had gone. He was sitting at the table with his jacket on and his empty coffee cup in front of him, looking at nothing in particular, the way a person looks when they have finished a large piece of work and have not yet decided what comes next. She sat down across from him. The late autumn light came through the tall windows at a low angle, touching the side of his face and the edge of the table and the faded canvas of his jacket. She did not have a prepared speech. She had been preparing speeches her entire career for investors, for regulators, for journalists, for boards, for the specific theater of professional communication that she had mastered so thoroughly it had become, in some ways, more natural to her than silence. She had no speech for this. She sat with the quiet for a moment and let it be what it was. Then she asked, "Why did you help me?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone searching for an answer, but the quiet of someone deciding how much of the real one to give. Then he said, 12 years ago, I was in a position not entirely different from the people who just tried to take your company. I was very good at finding vulnerabilities. I was very good at understanding how money moved and where the weak points were and how to apply pressure at the right moments. I was, for about 4 years, very successfully doing exactly what they tried to do to you, not to you specifically, but to companies, to positions, to instruments that were held by people who had built something real. He paused. He looked at the windows. I was good at it. And then one night I went home from a particularly successful quarter, and I sat in my apartment, and I tried to feel something good about it, and I couldn't. I couldn't find the thing in it that was worth what it had cost. Not financially. I had money. I mean what it had cost me in terms of the person I was becoming, the calculations I was making about other people, the way I had learned to see the world as a system of pressures and leverage points and nothing else. He stopped. He picked up the empty coffee cup, looked at it, set it down. I walked away, he said. It took me a long time to figure out who I was without it. The maintenance work helped. It's honest work. Something is broken, you fix it. No one gets hurt. The system works better when you're done. He looked at her. I helped you because what they were doing was wrong, because you built something real, and someone was trying to take it with tools I used to understand very well, and because he stopped again. A small silence. Because I thought you deserved to know there was a different way to see the world than the one you've been operating in. The thing he said landed somewhere she had not expected, not in the professional register she was accustomed to, not in the space where she processed arguments and evaluated positions, but somewhere quieter and more central, a place she had not visited in a long time. She sat with it for a moment. She thought about the check. $2 million. Offered as gratitude. Offered as acknowledgement. Offered because it was the only language she had reliably known for communicating value to another person. She thought about what it meant that he had given it back. Not because he didn't need money, not because he was making a philosophical point, but because the thing being offered was not, to him, commensurate with the thing he had done, not in a way that insulted the gesture, but in a way that existed in a different register entirely, a register she had not been fluent in for a very long time. She thought about the question she had carried for 10 days. What does a person have to lose before they learn that? She thought she was beginning to understand the answer. And the answer was not something she wanted to think about in this room, in this failing afternoon light, with everything that had just happened still warm around them. So she asked a different question. She asked, if it wasn't the money, what made you stay, through all of it? The 2 days, the board. Nathan, what kept you here? He looked at her for a long moment. The late light moved on his face. Something quiet and certain was in his expression. The look of a person who has thought a great many things through and arrived at a place of genuine clarity about most of them. Because you deserved to be saved, he said simply. And I was the only person in the building who could do it. She did not say anything for a while. The light went on changing. The city outside the windows was doing what cities do at the end of the afternoon, filling with the particular noise of 100,000 ordinary lives, taxis and conversations, and the sound of someone's music, through an open window somewhere below. She thought, I have been in this building for 9 years, and I have never heard any of that. She thought, I have been very good at my work for a very long time, and I have been almost entirely alone inside it. She thought, this man turned down $2 million and showed up anyway, and the reason he showed up had nothing to do with money, and nothing to do with strategy, and nothing to do with the kind of calculation she had been making her entire life. It had to do with something she did not have a clean word for. Something that lived in the space between competence and character, between skill and integrity, between the person you were capable of becoming and the person you actually were. Sterling Global did not collapse. The regulatory investigation moved through its proper channels over the following months, and Nathan Reeves was formally charged in the spring, the charges carrying the particular weight of a man who had understood exactly what he was doing and had done it anyway. The fund that had orchestrated the attack was dismantled by regulatory action and the civil litigation that followed, its principals subject to the specific and unpleasant consequences of having been caught operating a coordinated market manipulation. The infrastructure bond position was unwound carefully and at modest cost, and the capital was redeployed in ways that were, Victoria told her board in the quarterly review, somewhat more conservative than the previous approach. Sterling Global stock recovered fully within the quarter. The institutional investors remained. Several new ones joined. The financial press, which had covered the crisis with the appetite of a feeding, covered the recovery with the somewhat shorter but still satisfying appetite of a story with a clean ending. Victoria changed things. Not dramatically, she was not a person who changed things dramatically, who made sweeping gestures and announced transformations. She changed things quietly and specifically. She restructured the board's information access protocols. She changed how internal communications were handled. She spent more time in the building, on more floors, talking to more people who were not senior executives, the analysts, the assistants, the facilities staff who maintained the systems that kept the whole operation running. She stopped using the word price in the way she had always used it as a shorthand for the essential reducibility of all human motivation to a number. She did not stop believing that money mattered. She had not become naive. She had simply added something to her picture of the world that had been missing from it for a very long time. And the addition changed the proportions of everything around it. Ethan became the company's strategic advisor. The arrangement was informal at first, a consultancy, technically, organized through a legal structure that Nathan's replacement helped establish in the weeks after the crisis. He came in twice a week, sometimes 3 times. He continued to live in the apartment in Carroll Gardens. He continued to ride the subway. He brought coffee for the reception staff on Fridays, and when someone mentioned it to Victoria, she laughed, actually laughed, with the slightly startled quality of someone rediscovering a sound they had not made in years. He worked on the company's risk architecture, with the same quiet precision he had applied to the crisis, finding the hidden fault lines, and the misaligned systems, and the places where the structure was technically functional but not, in the deeper sense, sound. The analysts loved working with him. Claire, from the forensic desk, told someone that working with Ethan was like having an extremely good map of a territory you had been navigating by instinct for years. You thought you knew where you were going. You thought you understood the terrain. And then, someone showed you what it actually looked like from above, and you realized how much had been hidden from you, and how much clearer everything became when you could see it whole. Victoria and Ethan walked in the rain on a Thursday in late November, the Thursday before the Thanksgiving holiday. 3 months after the crisis, they had been in a working dinner that had run late. And when it ended, instead of taking her car, she said she wanted to walk for a little while. He said he'd walk with her. The city was quiet in the way it gets on the eve of a holiday, a particular emptiness in the streets that made the sounds of their footsteps audible. The rain was the fine, light kind, almost more mist than rain, the kind that turns the streetlights into soft halos and makes the wet pavement reflect everything above it in a way that doubles the city without quite reproducing it. Victoria said, after a while, "Maybe $2 million wasn't enough for what I actually needed." She said it lightly, which was the only way she could say it yet. He turned slightly to look at her. She kept her eyes ahead. "What did you need?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. She was thinking about the answer, trying to find the honest version of it, the one that was true all the way down. "Someone who couldn't be bought," she said finally. She said it without looking at him. She said it to the wet pavement, and the soft halos of light, and the city that was very quietly doing its ordinary work around them. He did not say anything immediately. He walked beside her through the fine rain, and then he said, quietly, in the easy tone of someone who has spent a long time learning how to say the true thing without weight, "You found him." Victoria smiled. It was a small smile, private. The kind that doesn't need an audience, the kind she had almost forgotten she was capable of, the kind that came from somewhere that money had never reached and couldn't have, no matter how many zeros were attached to it. The rain came down around them, gentle and indifferent and clean, and the city went on being itself in all its noise and light and ordinary beauty, and the two of them walked through it together, in the particular companionable quiet of people who have, between them, already said the most important things. 3 months after the crisis. At the end of a long Thursday, standing in the rain outside a building she had built from nothing, Victoria Sterling understood something she had not understood before, that the most important question she had ever been asked in a boardroom was not about strategy or capital or market position. It was the question she had asked a man in a canvas jacket, sitting alone at the far end of a conference table. "Why did you help me?" And the answer had not been about her company, or her money, or even her. It had been about something in him, a set of values that had survived a decade of being tested by the world's most effective, corrosive, which is the particular pressure that enormous amounts of money apply to the person you are trying to remain. He had survived it by leaving, by choosing the subway over the town car, the coffee cart over the corner office, the honest work of fixing broken systems over the lucrative work of exploiting them. She had not understood that kind of choice before. She understood it now. Not fully, she suspected she was still at the beginning of understanding it, but enough to know it was real, and that it mattered more than almost anything else she had spent her career believing in. There is a certain kind of wealth that has nothing to do with what you own and everything to do with what you cannot be persuaded to give up. Ethan Carter had known this for 12 years, since the night he sat alone in a quiet apartment above a city that was celebrating his success and felt the full, undeniable weight of what that success had actually cost him. Not in money, not in hours, not in any currency the world had a name for, but in the slow erosion of the person he had intended to become before the numbers became the only thing that mattered. He had paid for the knowledge with the best years of his earning life, and the particular grief of turning your back on a version of yourself that the world had rewarded lavishly. He carried it without bitterness, the way you carry something heavy once you've learned the correct posture, not easily, and not without the occasional, specific ache of a life that might have gone differently, but without permanent damage. As a fact of what you are, and not an argument against the life you chose instead. Victoria Sterling was just beginning to learn it. She was learning it the way she learned everything. With the full force of her intelligence, applied to a problem she had previously not recognized as a problem, and with a rigor she had once reserved exclusively for market analysis now turned inward, toward the harder and more resistant territory of who she was and who she still had time to become. With the willingness, which was perhaps the most important thing about her, and the thing that no one who didn't know her well would have guessed, to change her mind, to receive new information and let it change the shape of what she believed. To walk through rain on a November evening and let the quiet be a kind of answer. The check had been declined. The crisis had been survived. The traitor had been named. The company endured. And somewhere in all of that, something older and more valuable than any of it had passed between two people who had no reason to trust each other and had done it anyway, not because the math worked out, not because the incentives aligned, but because some things are not about math at all. And the people who understand that are rarer than money and worth considerably more.